Awesome. So, like Addie said, today I'm going to be doing a presentation on component testing, specifically with Cypress, and hopefully you guys will like it. We just talked about this, and it's my least favorite thing to talk about, which is myself. But it's always good to give some context of who's the stranger like talking. My name is Jordan Powell. I'm a developer experience engineer at Cypress. I'm a GDE in Angular, and I've been doing like creative things, software design, video editing, that type of stuff for the last 10 to 15 years. So been around a bit, but excited to share some of the things I've been working on. And you can follow me on Twitter at JordanPowell88 as well, if you would like to, and you're not already doing so. And if you are, please come and say hi. So today's agenda is basically like, first of all, what is Cypress? Like why, what separates it from other tools? And then we're going to talk about basically like breaking down what a component is, because for me, the thing, I didn't see the value of component testing until I really understood what a component is and how we traditionally have been testing components. And I quickly realized that I feel like I've been testing components wrong the whole time. I've been a developer for many years. And so yeah, we're going to do a breakdown on that. And then we're going to do a quick demo so we can basically take an app, add component testing from start to finish, and add basically like complete test coverage for component testing. But first, let's talk about Cypress. Again, to give some questions. For those of you who are participating, it would help for me to know where you are on the scale. My son always uses the words noob and pro. So if anyone would love to participate in this poll, I'd love to get people's general feedback on where they are in this scale, if whether like you've maybe heard of Cypress but never used it, or whatever. You're a 1 if you're like consider a pro or someone who uses it quite regularly. Okay, looks like we have some results starting to come in. It's always good to get some general feedback. Okay. Perfect. All right, so it looks like we have quite a few people that are pretty newish to Cypress. So we can go back and look at this later. So thank you for everyone who filled this out. We're almost about 30 votes. So looks like a pretty newish crowd to this. So if I go too fast or something, feel free to stop me. But for those of you who don't know, Cypress is basically an end-to-end test automation suite. And it's pretty popular. We have around 4.6 million downloads a week on NPM, approaching 5 million. So it's been around since 2000, and I think the alpha or the beta came out in 2015. So it's been around for a really long time, and it's become pretty mature product. And one of the things like that sets Cypress apart from other test runners is that it actually lives in the browser. So something that separates it from something like Protractor, Selenium, or even Playwright is that those testing frameworks live outside the browser, and they basically send messages. Your tests basically send messages to a browser, and basically the browser then interprets it and tries to then interact with your application like that. It's kind of like the game of telephone. We're used to like, tell a friend a message, and then they would tell someone else a message. And sometimes over time, that message would get skewed. But the difference is with Cypress actually lives in the browser itself. So you don't have to rely upon interpretation. And because of that, you get a much more like real world like testing experience because you're actually in the browser. And I like to say like those other testing frameworks are more automating the browser, where Cypress is really automating your application itself. So, and because it lives in the browser, you get access to a lot of the things that you as a developer already use, like time traveling. So you can get snapshots in time of what your of what your application looked like in various basically snapshots of time. You get debuggability, so the developer tools you use already in Chrome or Firefox or whatever, console logs, network tabs, sources, all that stuff you get by default in Cypress. You get real-time reload, so when you save a test, it will automatically reload in Cypress, and you get automatic waiting, which I won't have time to go into this super in depth, but essentially this is like one of the greatest benefits of Cypress is that other automation tools, you have to add a lot of waits that say, wait this amount of time for this request to come in, because browsers don't work synchronously, they're asynchronously. And so a lot of times you end up trying to make an assertion on something in the DOM that's not yet there. It's not always there at that time, and it's not always consistent. So sometimes it's there in less than 1 second, and other times it maybe take longer. So that's where things like Cypress, a tool like Cypress is really valuable, because you don't really have to even think about waiting for requests, because Cypress does automatic waiting for you. You get SPI stubs and clocks sort of as part of the framework. And anytime your tests fail, you can automatically get screenshots and videos of those failures. We also have support for Chromium, Firefox, Edge, Electron Brave, as well as we now have support for WebKit, so you can test in WebKit as well. We support 2 types of testing. End-to-end testing has sort of been the bread and butter of Cypress, the thing that has we've basically cut our teeth on, the things we became very well known for. And back in June of last year, in 2022, we released 10.0, and that version features a new type of testing called component testing. It is no longer in beta. It's in GA release, so you don't have to worry about that. It's fully supported. And we also, you can do other types of testing like API testing. I won't have time to go into that as well, but love to always point out that you can do really cool API testing as well. But in the end, the important thing is, like, if it runs in a browser, you can test it with Cypress. And that's one of my favorite things. It's like you could test emails, you could test pretty much anything, because Cypress runs in a browser. If you can run it in a browser, you can test it with Cypress. Okay, so now switching to what is a component. This may seem obvious, but if we really end up taking a step back, we'll maybe realize it's not maybe as obvious, right? Because when we think of testing, we think of this pyramid and we say, well, end-to-end testing, that's pretty obvious. Like we've done that with Cypress before, and we have unit tests for things, and oftentimes we unit test our components, and we maybe have some integration tests. But like, what is a component, right? So if we look at like what a component is, if we look in this box, like let's say the component is represented by this box. In Angular, a component has a class, and that class has a template. Whether it is basically a separate file or it's inline, it still has a template. And it also has potentially, in most cases, like a services or some type of dependency that you inject via the constructor, or even like the new inject function that comes in Angular 15. But the idea is like your component also has dependencies. And that component most likely, in a lot of cases, has children and maybe other children, and those children have children. And so you begin to really ask, like, what is a component then? Like, how would we test this? So oftentimes we would basically, if our component class had methods, we would write unit tests for those methods, which is fine because it does some sort of like sanity check for any logic we have. But if you're like me, I have never really liked putting much logic in my components to begin with, and I like to, in most cases, try to basically move that logic out of my components as much as possible. So then, in a lot of cases, there isn't even anything to unit test, right? But besides that, we also have an integration between our class and our template. We have bindings between the class and like directives and things like that we put inside of our HTML, and we have integrations that we end up In most cases, when we're unit testing a component, we have to basically stub like a service. For example, if we have like some service that makes an API call or something like that, we have to like that depends upon HTTP client module. And there are some libraries, even like Angular provides HTTP client testing module. They provide modules for you to sort of do these sorts of things. But even at that, they're still not the actual implementation. They are a test implementation of those things. So then we come down to like, how would we really test this to accurately feel like we're covering everything that covers inside this box? Like, well, before, the only way to really fully do this, in my opinion, was via end-to-end testing. But you're saying like, okay, what about a dumb component, right? Because we have lots of those in our applications as well. But even a dumb component, if we take the same analogy of a box, it still has a class, and that class has a template. And maybe there's not a lot to test there, but we didn't even mention in the previous slide CSS. So our component also has styles, and there's really not a way very easily to really do any sort of sanity check that validates that the component actually looks the way we expect it to look, right? And that's where, again, component testing sort of, was birthed to sort of solve this problem. So then we basically, in these cases, we would unit test that we can mount the component, but it doesn't really then provide a lot of value. Again, we're using then an integration between the class and the template and our test using a virtual DOM, but it's not the real DOM. And we still have an integration between CSS and our template. So again, like how would we accurately test this? So the way I like to do this is unofficial Cypress. This is Jordan's version of the new testing pyramid, where component testing kind of replaces a big chunk of this pyramid in a lot of cases, because our applications are comprised of a lot of components. But you component test like you do an end-to-end test in a lot of ways, but we're going to have lots of little components, so that it's kind of like a unit test, and our component have many integrations between the other parts, so it's kind of like an integration test. So that's why I like to say it's a test, almost like a test type in and of itself. So in the end, if we take a step back, we want to take this complex component we talked about, right? And we really want to be able to take that and we want to put it in our browser, and we want to be able to test it, because that's the way our users are going to interact with it. But we really don't want our component to look like this, because I don't really want to, my users don't care about the class or the template or the service, because this is what they see. So what we really want to be able to do is take this right here, this component that renders a part of our application, and we want to be able to make sure if I click any buttons, or if I interact with that component in any way that a user would, that the expected results in the DOM are what we would expect. So that's basically, in a nutshell, what a component is and why component testing is important. If we now look at like why component testing, like why do I even care about testing my components? Well, testing is important. In a lot of times it gets cut and things like that from our budgets and from releasing software. But if we're able to prioritize testing, you get documentation. So when you're writing component tests, it's really great, and you will see this during the demo, is that you'll see we're actually documenting every step, every basically state that a component has, kind of like we do in Storybook or something like that. You get the sort of like documentation of this component acts this certain way when I do this thing to it. You get isolation. So when you're building components, it's actually one of my favorite parts of component testing is if you're using component testing during the actual building phase, is you can just mount that component in isolation, and you don't have to serve your application and navigate to the page that has that component. You can just open Cypress, and then you see that component in isolation, and then you feel confident knowing that component, no matter how it's consumed, will interact, will behave the way you expect it to in isolation. You also get confidence, because testing at the end of the day provides confidence. When we ship components, when we ship our applications, we want to feel confident And at the end of the day, confidence in a good application improves our user experience. And those are things that we should care about as developers. Component testing with Cypress is supported by React, Angular, Vue, and Svelte, and they're like meta frameworks like Next and Create React App and that type of thing. Today, obviously, we're going to focus on my favorite, being Angular. So let's go ahead and let me switch screens here. But if I were to basically, this is an Angular 15 standalone application, and let me go ahead and serve it so you guys can see it. And let me wait for this to show up. But essentially, once we have a feel for what the app's going to do, basically it's just a login form. And then, this is something pretty common we have on a lot of applications. And if we type in our, password, it's going to make an HTTP request. That server is not working. So if I log in, it's going to basically say, hey, there's a 404 because, we're unauthenticated. So that's what we currently have. The cool thing is now let's add Cypress component testing to this. So this application isn't currently running Cypress in any way. So I'm going to go ahead and install Cypress as a dev dependency. So I can show you guys how easy it is to actually get set up and configure your applications using this. And for those of you who are using NX, there are generators and executors around this as well. So don't have time to show all that, but no worries for those using NX. Big fan of it myself. They walk you through a lot of this for you by yourself. So here we're on this welcome screen, and it's going to tell us neither end-to-end test or component testing is configured. In my case, we're talking about component testing, so I'm going to click this. Cypress is by default going to determine like, hey, I see you're using Angular, but you can see all these different other component frameworks are also supported as well. So I'm going to click next steps. It's going to basically say, yep, you have all the dependencies installed that we need from Cypress, and it's going to generate a config and a few supporting files. And from here, that gets us set up. And just a second. So now at this point, Cypress is going to identify what browsers are installed in your system. I'm just going to use Electron for now, but right now it's going to open and it's going to say, hey, you don't have any tests, and that's okay because, well, we don't have any tests. So let's go ahead and let's create a new file for our test. And so for this, we're just going to do app component.sci.ts. And one thing, if you have used Cypress end-to-end testing before, Cypress comes with a folder, and normally your end-to-end test would go in this end-to-end folder inside the Cypress folder. But with component tests, we want our component tests to live next to the components themselves. With end-to-end testing, there is really, there is no scope of components and things like that. So that's where, those tests go somewhere else. But here we have an app.component.sci.ts. And here we can begin writing our first test. And we're going to use same sort of testing nomenclature you're used to using. So we're going to do app component in our describe block. Then we're going to just say it can mount, because we want to see what it looks like, and we want to make sure it can. So by default, Cypress, all commands are prefaced with sci, and then you can has a new API called mount. And here is where I'm going to say, hey, I want to mount the app component. And here I'm just importing this from this app component. I press save, go back over here. Cypress now detects that, hey, you have an app component. So I'm going to click on this now. And when I open this, we now see that exact same login form. We didn't have to serve our app or anything like this. So now we can just sort of like keep this open for the time being. So we could interact with this at a high level, but let's start with something small like this button. So our component has a welcome screen, which is basically once you log in, it basically displays a welcome component instead of this login form. We then have this login form, and then we also have a button that is in here. And basically, this button has an event emitter that gets clicked when you click it, and it's using ng-conf for content projection. So let's go ahead and create a new file here, and we'll do button.component.sci.ts. And the cool thing about, if I step back to this app component for a second, normally before standalone, we would have to add something to the second argument of this mount function. And we'll still use this for some things, but just to show you, the second argument of this mount function is a mount config. And this has basically the same thing we're used to using in Angular for configuring our test bed. So it's like imports, declarations, providers, things like that. So normally we would have to do something like import our app module, but we don't have an app module, right? Or we would have to add any child components, that type of thing. But because standalone is, these standalone components are basically, it has all that information in the component itself. We don't have to configure anything. So it makes writing these tests like literally as simple, like super simple, right? And
Jordan,
yeah.
is it possible maybe to zoom in a little more on the text?
Yeah. Is that better?
Yeah, I think it's perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so now let's go back to our button component. Let me create it here. And we want to make sure it can mount. And if we do side up mount, do button component, and we import the button component, we press save, go back here. This is rerunning that same component, but now I want to go to click on the button component. And now we see a button, but there's no text inside of it. And that's because if you remember, our button is using content projection, which is something that you will oftentimes do in Angular and other frameworks as well. So there's a couple different ways we can do this. I'll show kind of the hacky way, and then I'll show you the a better, like a easier way, I guess. So in the case, one thing we could do is we could basically like create a wrapper component. So we could say something like can mount using a wrapper component, not like rapper, but like hip hop, but wrapper, like presents. And so what we would want to do is maybe we would want to basically, we would create like our own component here, and we would say, template, and we would sort of inline this, and we would basically at this point use the app button selector that we were using. And I'll point this out in a second, and we would say like, click me, and let's do class of wrapper component. So now if we click on this button component here, we see it's using the selector app-button. So that's why we're basically just creating our own component that is basically using this button. And here, if I click this, now if I do side.mount, and instead of mounting the button component, I want to mount the wrapper component. Now there's one thing that is different with this, is that we didn't tell this wrapper component like, hey, you need to have like it depends upon the button component. So we need to either add the button component here so that it knows, or we can add it in our test directly. So if we save this and do this, we now see click me here. Or we could take this out, and we should be able to add this down here and say imports wrapper component, or not wrapper component, but button component. So you can see this now. But I would say ideally, like this is not ideal that we have to create wrapper components and that sort of thing. So for I want to show another way you can also mount as well. I don't normally use this way of doing tests unless I have a case where I need to use content projection. So we can do let's do a test that says you can mount using the template syntax. So you can also, instead of referencing the component as the actual class name, you could also mount it using a string with the using basically like passing in the HTML that you care about. So here we are doing this. And the same thing here. In this case, we do need to import the button component because our mount function can't infer what type of component this is. It's basically read as a string. So we have to pass it as an import here. In these other cases, it can infer, hey, this is the button component, and then the Cypress mount includes that as part of your import. So now if I save this, we'll now see the exact same thing, but it's much cleaner to write, and we don't have to write all of this code just to wrap something like that. But again, this is like not that interesting of a test still. We need to do some other things. We're also not doing any assertions, so we could also like write something that says we want to use sci.get, and get is Cypress's way of basically getting something from the DOM, and it uses CSS selector. So if we had like an ID that was called button ID, or if we're using like CSS classes, we could use .button, something like that. Or you can use the actual element itself, or like ARIA labels, accessibility, anything like that. So in this case, we want to get a button, and we want to make sure that it says click me. So we can basically rewrite this test, and now we actually have an assertion. And when I click on this, you can see we can see every single one of these steps happening. Okay, but one thing we haven't really done is like we haven't tested any of the most important thing that button does, which is emit an event when it's clicked. So if we want to test that, there's a couple different ways we can do this. So we want to say that when the button is clicked, we want to make that sure that it should call the on-click event emitter, because when we click this button, it basically calls this event emitter. So we want to be able to test that. And we don't know what the parent component does with it. We just need to make sure that when we click it, that event gets emitted. And that's basically the end of responsibility for that component. So now we can go ahead and sci.mount. We can do button component. And there's a couple things that we can do. We could do something like this, where the mount actually returns an object, and this is like chainable. So we could do .then. And if we just make this a response, we can then chain into this, and we could say, we see that response has a component, and it also has the fixture, which is something, it's kind of like an escape hatch for those who need to do certain specific things with the fixtures, which is how we like done things before in Angular. But in this case, we want to create a spy. So Cypress has a spy built in by nature. So we call sci.spy. And what we want to spy on is the response, the components, and the on-click method. And that on-click has a method called emit. And we want to also give that spy an alias so we can reference this later. So we're going to call it on-click. And here we're going to then do sci.get.button, and we want to click the button, and then we want to then use sci.get. And the same way we're using sci.get to select something from the DOM, we're going to use the same thing to reference our spy. So if we go here, we can use the alias syntax, which is the @ sign. So if we use @ and then we reference on click, which is this right here, then we could say should have been called. So now if we rerun this test, hopefully it passes. And now we'll see we're not passing in anything, which isn't a big deal, but we want to make sure, hey, when I click it, this event got fired, and you can see it did in fact get called. So that's kind of the end of the responsibility for this component. But let's do something a little bit more complex, right? Because our button is one thing, and the cool thing is we can visually get a really good indicator of what our button component looks like and the way it works and that sort of thing. But it doesn't necessarily give us the full story of our application, right? It doesn't tell us that much thing. One of the things that is a crucial part of our application is the actual login form. So let's go to the login form. Let's create a login form.component.side.ts file. So here we're going to login form component, do the same sort of thing we were just doing. We want to make sure it can mount. We then call, side.mount and login form component. So now let's save this. Let's go back here and click on login form. And we should now see the login form, which looks a lot like our app component, but our app component is a parent that then takes the response from the form and it does some things. But there are certain validation rules in our form and things like that we do want to check. So let's do a couple of those scenarios now. So one thing that we do want to do, let's see, we could check a couple things, but let's go ahead and start testing the form itself. So let's say that we want to make sure that it should call on login with a username and password when the login button is clicked. And so if we look at the login form, basically when the login button is clicked, it's going to call handle submit. And if it has a username and password, it's going to call this and emit the username and the password. And so here, what we want to do is we want to side.mount our login form component. And we also need to create a SPY. So we need to use this then syntax. Let's do response. And there's a couple different ways we can do this, but for now, we'll just do this .spy response.component.onLogin, and then do emit. And we're going to give it an alias of onLogin SPY. So now we're mounting it and we're creating a SPY for our onLogin. So now we need to go and actually, we want to make sure that we go ahead and validate this use case, right? So we want to get the username, username input. So what we can do is we want to get a side.contains, and we could use something like, we want to make sure it contains a username, right? And we want to then find its input. And we then want to set an alias. So we could say username input if we needed to reference this later. And then, or if we don't need to reference it later, we can just do this, do type. And then we could just start typing in, let's go test user 123, right? Something like that. And we need to do the same thing for the password. And so let's do password, and we're going to find a input, find the password's input, and we're going to type secret. Okay, so now if we save this, let's go back and see what's happening. So now we see it found the username, it typed its input here. We then typed in the password, but we're not actually clicking anything or validating anything yet. So now we need to reference our SPY. So now we can do SPY.get, use the alias syntax and do on login spy, which came from here. And then we can say should have been called, but we could do called with because we know exactly what should have been called with. And we should say it should have been called with username and the username of this. And we could, if we really wanted to make this fancy, we could do this. And make this like this, pass in a username here. So we're not passing around magic strings. So let's copy this, put this here, call it password. And let's pass this here. And then down here, we can just say it should have been called with username and password. So that should do this, except for one last thing is we're not actually clicking the button, so it's not actually going to get called. So if we save this, we'll see it will actually error, which is a good thing. It's good for it's saying, hey, I never got this spy, right? So if we go and do side.get, and then we do get a button, and we could do .contains, and it says login, I think. So we could do login. Then we can then do .click. So now if we resave this, we have a passing test and we're validating that this gets called with the right username and password. And at this point, the parent component, which is our app component, can handle a certain scenario. So there's a couple other things we could do, like validate that, certain error messages show up and that sort of thing. But for the sake of time, I'm going to skip something like that. And I'm going to do one more use case here at our app component level, which is the first test that we wrote. But if we go back to this, we're not doing any assertions. We're just validating that the component can actually mount in the DOM. But one thing we want to do is we want to add some level of additional validation, right? Because there's some logic that gets happened. So like when you have the right validations, it should then show the welcome component so we can validate something like this, that type of thing. So as well as like if we get a bad 401 back or something, how do we handle those scenarios? But for the first case, let's do it should redirect to the welcome screen when the credentials are correct. So basically when you get a 200 back when you try to log in. So if I do side.mount and do the app component, then I can do, I need to basically side.contains. This is kind of the same thing we just did, is we're getting the username and then we're finding the input, its input, and then we're going to type test user. And then we're going to get side.contains password. And we're going to do find, get its input, and we're going to type test password. And in this case, we're not going to actually be calling the API. So the values of these are not what's important. And so there's a couple things we could do here. We could basically provide some type of how we would normally do this before component testing is you would do like some fake service that would return a certain response or something like that. But in this case, we don't have to mock anything in Angular. We can just use something in Cypress called side.intercept. And basically what this does is I'll show you if we go to our test here and I open up our inspector, click on the network tab. If I were to click, let me refresh this test. And if I were to make this a little bigger, if I were to type something here, click login, you'll see it's going to call this auth endpoint. And at this point, it's returning a 404, which is what's displaying. But basically, we want to intercept this request in the browser. So we don't want to basically touch anything in our application. We want to do this all in Cypress. So we can use Cypress to do this, and it's really easy. So we know that this is a post request. And from there, we want to say the auth endpoint. And from here, I actually don't really care what the status code is because my app's logic is just basically referencing the status code. So if I say the status code is equal to 200, I can give it a body as well. I could say the body has maybe a status in it of 200, and it maybe has like some message that says you're authenticated or whatever, right? So at this point, I'm saying we're telling Cypress to set up an intercept. So intercept any post request to this response, to this endpoint, and basically return this instead. So now if I run this, nothing's going to happen because I haven't actually submitted anything at this point because I haven't actually clicked this button. But if I now go and I do site.get the button that contains login, then I click, then we should see what happens. And now we see this welcome component. So now we can basically copy this. And now after this happens, I want to validate that our apps contain something that says welcome test user. And now we have a passing test. So this is a really good way that you can add like very much like end-to-end testing, but for individual components. So let's add one final use case for our app component, but in a case where it actually fails and we want to, and like things like this used to be really like are difficult to do without intercepting requests because you either have to make the full request and have configure your database or your service to basically return, to basically give you the response you want, or you have to basically create mock services that do these things. But in this case, you don't have to touch either one of those things, and you just tell Cypress, hey, just return these requests and don't actually make the full recall. So in this case, we want to write one more test that says it should show error messages when creds are incorrect. So in this case, we want to site mount. We want to mount the app component, and we want to basically, we can kind of copy most of this code. It doesn't matter what these like typed answers are, but for the sake of like clarity, we could say like bad user or something like that, or bad password. So it's a little clearer why we're getting this. And in this case, we want to return a 401, and we want to display a message because our app displays, reads the message that returns back from our API. So we could say like bad username or password, something like that. So now if we get this button that contains login and we click it, then we should see, we want to then validate that we get this message somewhere in the DOM. So now if I press this, rerun our tests, we get the good one, and we're now seeing this. And you'll see also, we see this in our network, we saw the auth, and we're saying, hey, it's actually, it appears as if it's making the request. We're getting a post, we're getting the 200 back, and this is the response back, which is everything we had in our test. And here's the bad case where we're getting the 401 and the exact message we had. So this is a great way we can like fully test, fully baked components in a way that's very, very real to how users interact with it. Because like testing is something that's difficult, and we don't want to waste time doing types of testing that's difficult, right? So if we can make testing easier, that adds value for everyone. At this point, I don't want to like keep just writing tests, but one other thing I'll point out, and we'll go ahead and get to some questions here. But in the meantime, one other thing to kind of point out was with component testing, there is, and if you go to the Cypress folder and click on support, you'll see a component.ts file. And basically these are basically like global things you can tell Cypress to run before it runs any of your tests. So essentially what it's doing is when we configure your app for to use component testing, it's basically doing this work for you, but we have a Cypress Angular package that gets shipped, and we're using that mount function, and that was the side up mount thing that we saw we kept using when we were mounting our components, and then we're configuring it here. But you could create custom mounts. So if you had like a certain type of your application that had different providers, that type of thing, you could create additional mounts. You could also like add, for example, if you're not using standalone and you'll find yourself like keep adding the same imports or providers or declarations, that type of thing, it's really easy to go in here and basically update this mount function. So that way, every time you call mount, it automatically adds those things to mounting your component. So just different ways you can sort of tweak your testing workflow and strategy so that it becomes as easy as possible for you. So cool. Addy, looks like we have about 10 minutes left or so. What type of questions we got here?
Yeah, so first off, thank you for putting this together. I mean, like, as always, you know me, I love your presentation in general, and there's always something new. I mean, I never get used to the level of details you go into, and then how much more, like, even though I felt like I understood something, how much you take that time to really lay it out. And thank you for even like adding the Slido.com in there and like gauging the audience a level of understanding. I think that's a very nice touch right there that most of us should start like implementing in our presentation. So that's the kudos right there. There's a few questions in there, but there's one thing that I wanted to ask real quick before like going through the Q&A. Is it fair to say that this way of testing lends itself better to like presentational or simpler component? Or what do we do when we have more complex components that have a lot of like data logic instead of like presentational logic?
Yeah, this is a great point. I would say the answer is no. Well, yes, but not as much as you would think. So like the reason why is normally testing components like that was like extremely painful. Like you end up having to spend all your time essentially tricking the Angular compiler to fake all these dependencies. Like I don't really care. Like I don't even care about any of these dependencies. I just need you to run, and I'm gonna end up mocking those responses anyways or something. So the good thing is with this type of testing is you don't use the mocks or the fakes in most cases unless you like had a certain use case. You actually use the real thing unless you're using something like WebSockets or like some like really kind of strange use case. You don't really want to make request back and forth, in a component test or even a unit test. So you can use the full like production implementations of things, because what we end up doing is we end up creating a bunch of like fake services that then just return a certain response or something like that.
Yeah.
But it's possible like we could write our mocks or our fakes wrong, right? And so our tests aren't really providing value we think they are. Exactly. But with this type is you can get the great, like, it's like shipping your actual code to a browser and then you're running tests against it. So yeah, it's going to be more difficult because you're going to have to configure the Cypress to how to compile it, right? And we're just wrapping the Angular compiler, but it's much easier because you don't have to do the types of heavy lifting you used to have to do to be able to do this type of testing. So hopefully that provides some deeper level of clarity. And the good thing is the standalone, like it just works, like it's awesome.
Yeah, that's one of the advantages right there, definitely. So are you able to see the Q&A yourself?
Yeah, so like I see Glenn just mentioned, like if your components are not standalone, like what changes in the way we configure and use Cypress component testing? So one of the things I would like to do, like I would say in most cases, like what I find myself doing, unless you have a really large application, is you can customize your mount config so that it just includes like your app module or things like that. So the main big difference is every time you mount, you're going to have to, Angular doesn't know based upon the component what other dependencies it needs, what services it needs, what modules you need to import or child, anything you need to declare. With standalone, it can infer those things, but it's not a big deal because it works. It's really the same experience. The only difference is you, the developer who's writing the test, will have to configure the test itself, how to provide those types of things for you. But if you find yourself oftentimes doing the same type of imports or providers or that type of stuff, you can just update your mount function so that it always adds those things to your mounts. So that way you don't have to keep repeating yourself when you're building them out, which is I don't know. I find that really a better approach. And oftentimes you could just like import the app module and that has, unless you're doing like you have a very modular application, in most cases that would work, or you could separate mounts by certain features and have different mounts for those types of features that import those features modules. So there's lots of different ways you can kind of skin that cat per se, but for the most part, that's going to be a better approach. So Bradley says, would you ever put side app mount in a before each? You could. The only reason why you wouldn't want to do that is, and one thing we didn't get to is like if your component takes an input or something like that, there is an option in the mount function that config that you pass where I showed you could do imports and providers. There's a component properties thing, which basically gives you access to all the public properties, methods, and things like that in the component class itself. That's where you normally would pass like, hey, this is the input that my component needs, that type of thing. So if you have a component like that your before each hook would maybe like you'd have different instances where your mount would actually change between your tests. So if the tests don't change, the mounting doesn't change between the types of tests you need to run, then you're good with a before each hook, and that's something you could I would definitely recommend. Let's see. Do we need to do side at dismount from the code? I assume Islamic done by Cypress. Yes. So basically, the thing that Cypress does behind the scenes is every time we start a new test, basically Cypress trashes the old DOM and basically unmounts the previous component. So you don't have to worry about tearing down or cleaning up anything, which is really great. So yeah, that's the great thing. And it is actually a difference between the way like Angular, like Karma testing, if you were to mount a component the way we like kind of do it out of the box with Angular, is they actually tear down every test at the end of the test. But it's different with Cypress because there's a lot of cases where, you still want to see your component in the DOM and interact with it. So we don't want to tear it down. So we actually tear it down before the next test starts. So that's kind of how we go about doing that. So, but great question. No need to worry about tearing down those questions as well. Will the slides be available? Yes, I can share the slides. Let's see. There's a lot of questions in here. We use Machio for many of our testing. Can we intercept the API request in Cypress and ask it to call my Machio API? Yeah, so last night I did a kind of demo talk for the Angular community meetup, and I actually was using component testing and I was intercepting requests, but I was also using Faker, which is like another similar API or similar library for mocking. And yeah, you can absolutely do that. So if you have questions like how to do that, feel free to go back and watch that recording. And I'm just flying through these. Is it possible to have multiple component files with the mount configuration, like one per component rather than one per project? One. I'm not sure I understand this question. Multiple component files with mount. Oh, like more than one mount function, I think what you're saying. So yes, so you could create by default side up mount is shipped, and you can override that and create your own, or you could create, like, say you had like a maybe you lazy load modules in your application. You could have a product mount that you configure with all the things that it needs to mount a product, anything in the product module, or maybe you had like a shared library. You do that sort of thing. So that's a way you can have multiple mount configurations per project. You just name those mounts differently. Looks like we're about at time. Let's see. Is the Angular community or Cypress recommend that all new components be standalone, or is standalone a special case? Would you recommend converting legacy components to standalone? So this, I think, just depends upon your use case and your team. I don't use standalone that often, but I wanted to show you how easy it is to use with standalone. And it's basically the same experience from a component testing standpoint with Cypress. So I guess that depends in a lot of cases by your team, but just from a pure testing standpoint, with Angular and component testing, like you saw how easy it is. You don't have to really configure your component at all, because basically it can, unless you're doing like some of those edge cases like content projection or something like that, for the most part, it knows exactly what it needs to handle mounting, which is, really great. Let's see. And for those, I have it written down. I don't want to forget my friend Q, who's also a Cypress ambassador, is going to be doing kind of like a follow-up talk a little bit about this for the Angular community meetup, I think sometime next month. So that's a great place to start as well. Is it possible to component test an Angular directive? No, yes, but no. Like you could do it, but I don't know how valuable it would be. Mostly because at the moment, component tests are really just meant for components, because it runs in the browser, and that's the main benefit, is your components live in browsers. Directives are more basically, for lack of better words, pure function. So unit testing, something like that, is going to be the best way to test your actual directives. But if those directives, they're being consumed by something, by a component or something, it's a really good idea to test the components that consume those directives, because those are the things that your users end up, that's like the side effects the users end up having. So that's what I would recommend doing. Woo! Cool. I think that's probably good. Let's see. Is there any other questions I have? Was there, let's see, question? See, is there any more? There's like so many questions. I don't think I'm going to be able to get to all these, but if you would love to, I'd love to follow up with you. So if you feel free to reach out to me on Twitter at JordanPowell888, I'd be happy to follow up with you and answer questions specifically, as well as, if your team is trying to get this set up, I'd love to, if I can help get it configured. And once you get it configured, start writing tests. I think y'all will fall in love with it, and testing will be like fun again, right? So cool. Thank you guys for having me. Is there anything else that I need to do to sign us off here, Bree?